Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome back to A House Divided, coming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptason, and I will be your host for this afternoon's event, this afternoon's interview and discussion about Ways and Means, featuring author Roger Lowenstein. We're going to introduce you to Roger here in just a second. Abraham Lincoln Bookshop is an independent bookshop. Since 1938, we have brought you the best in books, autographs, artifacts, antiquarian books, and new books about Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, and the US presidency. We are here in Chicago, Illinois, and you can come on in and visit us. And you can also see us at alincolnbookshop.com. And I hope you will enjoy seeing everything that we have to offer at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. Roger Lowenstein, thank you and welcome to our program.
Bjorn, it's such a pleasure to be on this program with a house full of Abraham Lincoln specialists, I'm sure.
Of course. And well, it's great to have you in the house with us. For the folks out there, Roger Lowenstein is the author of numerous critically acclaimed books, including the New York Times bestselling Buffett, When Genius Failed, America's Bank, and The End of Wall Street. Roger was a reporter for Wall Street Journal for over a decade, and now he writes books for a living. And I know that that must be pretty gratifying, Roger.
It's terrific. I couldn't be happier and luckier. So
yeah. Well, okay. The first question I was going to ask was a question from our my boss and our owner, Daniel Weinberg, the owner of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, and he wanted to know why there was why another journalist was honing in on history, and to which I thought, well, 80 some years ago, Ralph Newman had a secondhand bookshop, and two journalists, Lloyd Lewis and Carl Sandburg, from the Chicago Daily News, kept coming over and spending all afternoon drinking with Ralph Newman, until finally Carl Sandburg said, Newman, you should just sell all these books and open something called Abraham Lincoln Bookshop and only sell books about Abraham Lincoln.
Now, is this before or after Sandburg wrote his biography of Lincoln?
That was after Sandburg had written it, but before it was published. So Sandburg was a savvy marketer in that way. And Newman said, sounds like a good idea to me. Cheers. He sold his entire stock, went into business selling books about Abraham Lincoln. So thank you, journalist, for plunging into the world of history. But tell me, do you see any difference in the way you approach your topic with a lifetime of journalism behind you?
You know, not really. Particularly, I've done some of the books I've written were contemporary, so they relied on a lot of interviewing, and that was obviously drew on journalistic skills. But you can't interview many people for the book on the Civil War, not in 2020. So the same as an academic or a professional. I mean, I am a professional. I don't know what the difference is at this point, but you go to archives, you read the letters, you read the papers, you draw on the incredible volume archives of published works, which in the Civil War are just remarkable. If you didn't draw on that, you'd be a fool. Yeah. And then you sit down for 3, 4, 5 years, in my case, and read through your notes and think about it and write it. And I don't, at that point, I think that the distinctions sort of fall away. I mean, you're trying to tell the benefit of a journalist, hopefully, is that you know how to tell a story in an entertaining way, but you've got to you very close to the facts and be telling it accurately. Otherwise, you know, you really can't call yourself a professional. So,
right. Well, I'll tell you this: and this topic, for those watching this later, and you might be watching this later on our YouTube channel. If you are watching it later on our YouTube channel or in some other form, we may still have copies of Ways and Means, and you could buy it from us. But for those of you who are like me, who are frankly frightened of an economic or financial analysis of the Civil War, you need to know that Ways and Means is a brilliantly written story of the financial history of the Civil War. And it is not one of those analytical books that is going to go so deep into the weeds with graphs and so on, although there's some good graphs. We're going to talk about them later. It's not one of those academic books of deadly prose. It is a fascinating page-turning narrative history of the financial Civil War. And to quote Eric Foner, the historian who reviewed this book, Lowenstein is a lucid stylist. He is able to explain financial matters to readers who lack a specialized knowledge. You've written a great story of the financial history of the Civil War. Tell us about that. Tell us how you take economics and finance and weave them into a story.
Well, one way is to put it in terms that the average person can relate to. Maybe inflation sounds a little scary, although we're all dealing with inflation right now in the year 2022. But people can understand if the price of flour, a barrel of flour in the South, was $5.50 in the beginning of the war, right before the war, and 2 years later, it was so scarce that the women of Richmond were breaking into the supply stockades to just break into it and take out flour because it was going for $38. Mm-hmm. And if they can't understand that, they can probably understand what it meant when a year later it was $220. And if they didn't understand that, they can probably understand that nearly a year later, as the war is coming to a close, it was $1,000. So that's some powerful inflation. That's telling you that for the average Southerner, the Confederate government wasn't working. And that was going on across the economy with every commodity. I'll put the word commodity in quotes, except for one. The price of one commodity was falling, and that was the price of slaves, of enslaved labor, as people began to realize, hey, this war may not be going, the way we thought it was. And I think using examples like that, and the other way is I use a lot of diarists, people who were keeping accounts both at a very high level, people who were drinking port wine with Jefferson Davis and reporting back as the Southern elite, the Confederate elite, were getting worried, and people at a very ordinary level who were reporting the pounds that the family members were losing and the meager rations they were having at the dinner table as food began to grow scarce. So, although I try to explain the economic policies, I also try to keep what it meant for the average Southerner in view.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think you do a great job.
And Northerner, but that's a
the Northerners too. It's not a Southern view.
No, but that's a vivid example, I hope.
Yeah. Well, let's start with, although it's a story of the Civil War, but let's start with our guy. He's right there on the dust jacket, and Lincoln plays an important part in this story. Although I think probably most of the rest of our conversation is I want to introduce our viewers to some other really interesting people that they may be meeting for the first time. But let's start by talking about Lincoln. After all, there he is, he's on the dust jacket and his name is in the title. Lincoln came into the war with little knowledge of military strategy, and he ended up being pretty closely involved with the military strategy of the war. He also knew very little about finance coming into the war. So how do you think he, as commander-in-chief, did? And did he successfully leave finance to his Treasury secretaries, Chase and Pleasonton?
Well, I think the reason why Lincoln is so important to this story, this Civil War story in particular, is there's an unknown Abraham Lincoln. We all know about Lincoln the Emancipator. We all know about Lincoln, who struggled to get his generals, particularly McClellan, to fight the war. As Lincoln said, if you don't use the army, I'll borrow it. But not many people, I think, realize that for the first 2 decades of his life, Abraham Lincoln, of his political life, was completely consumed with economic policy. This is the 1830s and 1840s. The slavery issue was suppressed or sort of out of view for most of that period. Abraham Lincoln, a young legislator in Illinois, was consumed with building good roads, having the government do that, having the government finance canals, railroads, getting back a national banking system, which Andrew Jackson had gotten rid of, a tariff so that manufacturers in the middle part of the country could compete with England and people in Europe. This was his Richard Hofstadter said, for Lincoln, the acid test of a democracy was an economic test. He wanted government. He believed in the federal government, not a Jeffersonian government that governs least, but a real active government that would provide opportunity, economic opportunity for the man on the rise up, the person like himself. And yeah, he reminded the Congress, the first time he ever spoke to Congress, July 4th, 1861, the war is broken out. He's called a special session. I need men. I need money. That's why he called it. But he took a pause and said to remind the Congress and the American people why they were fighting. He said, the leading object of government is to elevate the condition of men. And then he went on throughout his administration, creating a real tax system, a banking system, Homestead Act, Transcontinental Railroad, Morrill Land Grant College Act, Department of Agriculture. He made the government into an engine of opportunity. And that, so that although Salmon Chase, who we're going to get to, the Treasury Secretary, and Fessenden handled the financial details, Lincoln was very much behind it and in favor of it and promoting it. In fact, these were issues he'd worked for mostly on the losing side all of his pre-presidential career.
Yeah. I had to make a note just now before we started talking. You also quote Emerson, calling him the middle class president.
Yes, this is almost a backhanded compliment. Emerson is, of course, a New England sophisticate. It took New Englanders quite a while to get used to Lincoln, his New England college folk, upper class folk, literary folk, his rough-hewn manners, his knee slapping, his Cracker Barrel jokes. When he gathered the cabinet to announce the Emancipation Proclamation to them, first he loosened them up with reading stories from some silly little jokester book. Salmon Chase was terribly put off. He thought it was very undignified. And Emerson, I think, is alluding to this. He's a middle class president. He's really of the people. Of course, Emerson said he went on to say we like him, not one less for it.
Right.
But he was not a powdered wig, and nor were any of the leading Republicans. These were people who'd made it up themselves. They were self-made men, and I think that explains a lot of their agenda.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, I want to take a step. You already checked a couple boxes for me, but I want to take a look at some of these financial outcomes of the Civil War, and just to illustrate what you've already introduced, the revolution in the economy that Lincoln brought about and that the Civil War brought about. Financial outcomes of the Civil War include a national union. I don't think we think of that as being something that wasn't there before. The Transcontinental Railroad, New Deal style revolution in the federal government, public colleges, the Morrill Land Grant. Justin Morrill had talked about a dream of middle-class kids going to college, learning practical arts, said it would be a blessing for the ages. So I think of this as Whiggish, as a Whig point of view. Absolutely. And if it is the Civil War actually does it represent a tragic opportunity for Whigs?
Well, the Whigs, of course, for those in the audience who aren't up on Whiggery, were the main competition for Andrew Jackson's Democrats in the 1830s, 40s, and early 50s. And they were about promoting opportunity, promoting growth, promoting prosperity. They were all for the little man, but they were all for business too. Abraham Lincoln said, "It's good that some men should be rich. It shows that others become rich." So he was not a redistributionist. These people weren't socialists or anything. They were for capitalism, for enterprise, but they wanted to spread it to the little guy, and they believed in using government to do that. Whereas the Jacksonians, they were laissez-faire. They didn't want the government anywhere near business. problem for the Whigs, they tried to dodge the slavery issue. It was just, there were Whigs in the South too, and Whigs in the North, and they just thought, well, better for us not to take a position in it. And by the 1850s, when first the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act came around, there was no more compromising or avoiding the slavery issue, and the party died out of irrelevance. And many of the, I'd say most of the former Whigs, and some Democrats like Salmon Chase, but mostly Whigs, coalesced, of course, under the banner of the Republicans, with many of the same issues. When they went to Chicago for the convention in 1860, obviously it's an anti-slavery party, the Republicans. They had lost once in 1856, not that close an election. And Horace Greeley, a big-time Whig, says the people can only swallow a little anti-slavery. We have to give them economic issues. We have to give them a tariff. We have to give them homesteads. We have to give them moral colleges, and so on and so on. So, like today, the more progressives realized that the electorate might not swallow all that super progressive stuff, and that was anti-slavery back then. Mm-hmm. So they leavened it with all these economic issues. So and many of the Whig agenda had been passed under Buchanan, but Buchanan vetoed them all. So this was their opportunity under Lincoln.
Okay. Yeah, and of course, I guess my question didn't get quite to the fact that the Whigs didn't exist. It was Whiggish policies that
correct.
that the Republicans were able to institute once the war started.
Absolutely right. Lincoln's hero was Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. They were the Whig leaders, and these ideas, his ideas remained Whiggish even as a Republican.
Right. Now, to get us into the war, once it started, we're going to bring Sherman into the discussion, and it's not the same Sherman that is in most Civil War books. It is the brother. So at the beginning of the war, Senator John Sherman recalled the U.S. was physically strong, but financially weak. That's an interesting quote. So why was the Union, which we in the 21st century often think of as an economic powerhouse, what does John Sherman mean that it's financially weak?
Well, let's see what the Union had and what it didn't have. It had no national currency. The currency that did exist, which was individual notes from individual banks, each one different, the government wasn't even allowed to touch. There was no taxation system, zero. There was a tariff, but it's kind of hard to collect a lot of tariff duties when there's a civil war going on. Not too many people want to ship into your ports. As I said, there was no national bank. There was no, the credit of the country had gone from 6%, being able to borrow it to 6% to 12%. In fact, when they tried to sell a loan, some of the offers came in at 18, 30%, basically banana republic stuff. If people are offering you interest rates in the teens, no different then as now, it means people don't trust you a lot. So there was no currency, there was no banking system, there was virtually no ability to borrow. That's why there was I say in the book, there was no union in financial terms.
Yeah.
We had no national currency. So what the government did in the very beginning, to stay in the beginning for a second, was Salmon Chase went to the banks and said, lend me your gold. And that's how wars have been financed in the past. And when you think of banks, they weren't big institutions with thousands of shareholders. When you borrowed money from a bank, you were borrowing money from the bank president and a few of his investor partners. And that was it. And the New York and the Philadelphia and the Boston banks cobbled together 50 million in gold coins. And when Chase got that loan, and they were reluctant to do it, but when he got that loan, they said at a dinner, Mr. Chase, we've lent you the enormous sum of $50 million. And we think that should quite suffice. Well, before the war was over, he spent that sum 60 times over, 60 times over. The Union spent more money that had been spent in every year in the Republic combined. How are they going to get it? Sherman had no idea, and that's what he meant.
Okay. Yeah, this actually, this means I want to skip over a couple of things that I was going to talk about, because we're talking, I love that scene, and you paint that scene so wonderfully in the book with the bankers telling Chase, patting themselves on the back. We are going to,
right.
we're saving the Union for you with our gold. But that brings Chase into the conversation. And okay, so how does he spend the money? The gold 60 million times over, or however many times over, 60 times over. Well, this brings the greenback into the conversation, the national currency. And this is something that caught me by surprise. The idea of legal tender was revolutionary.
It was
Just the
revolutionary.
idea.
It was shocking. At the end of the first year, 1861, the bank shut the gold window. So there's going to be no more gold loans.
Mhm.
And they got to finance it with something. And a congressman named Eldridge Spaulding from upstate New York proposes legal tender, paper, not that it's an IOU you can take or not, that you must take. It's money.
Yeah.
This literally shocks people. As one says, I protest. This was William Fessenden, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, the most powerful financial legislator in the country, said, I protest against making anything but gold or silver a legal tender. They thought it was a blasphemy. It was telling a lie to call paper money. After all, people who had borrowed gold and had a debt would now be able to pay it back with paper. Another legislator said, it's not money any more than a contract to deliver flour is flour. It was just a promise of it. But no, not now. Now they were saying these paper bills, the $1 bill would have the picture of Chase on them. They're going to be money itself. And that was born the famous greenback. And they were so successful, not only did every store and investor in the North accept them, they circulated deep into Dixie, much to the chagrin of Jefferson Davis. The Confederacy passed a law against dealing with them, but merchants knew that they're more valuable than the Southern notes. And so, they winked and took them anyway.
Right. And go ahead, you were finishing?
No, I just say they knew if they took them, they could pass them on to the next guy more easily. Whereas if they took a Confederate note, who knew what it'd be worth the next day? Or by the end of the war, there were slaves seen in Richmond frequently pushing wheelbarrows full of notes from the stamping press around town. Well, much better to take a greenback.
Right. And so since we're on Chase now and we're not going to have a whole lot of time, I told everybody about 10 minutes ago that your book does have some graphs, but it's not the academic kind of book where you spend 1,000 words describing the graph, then you show the graph, then you spend another 1,000 words showing what we just saw. No, this is more of the picture is worth 1,000 words kind of graph. And so let's take a look at the greenbacks and what happened to those. And I think this graph gives you an excellent opportunity to show how the greenbacks are revolutionary, yet somehow by the end of the war, we kind of get used to them, don't we?
Yes, that's right. You can see in the top there on the left, they start at $100 of greenbacks is worth almost $100 of gold, only 97.80, but pretty close. And then as the Union's fortunes seem to fade and people are so worried. Of course, you remember the summer of 1864, Grant's stuck in the mud in Petersburg.
Right.
And people are thinking maybe this war is never going to end. The greenback here plunges to even below $40 worth. And then once those armies start moving, and of course, the other Sherman, takes Atlanta and moves on to Savannah and so on, the greenback goes, way up to close to $80. And, that's not 100, but look, there's inflation in every war. There was inflation in World War I. There's inflation in World War II. There's going to be inflation in this country right now because of the war over in Europe, as we know. But this is a tolerable level. I'll just give you one number in the. You're going to go to the Confederate graph next?
Yeah. Let's go ahead and go to the. We can compare these greenbacks to.
Okay, so we'll look at the next graph, and that'll be a very visual way of seeing it.
All right. So here's what happens with Confederate money. Hyperinflation.
So you can see that $1 of gold in Confederate notes soars up to beyond $90, 90 for one. That's a rate of inflation. In the North, the total inflation through 4 years is about 80%. Well, that sounds like a lot. It was a burden. In the Confederacy, it was 9,000%. 9,000%. We talked about the barrel of flour going from $550 to $1,000 and so on. Some products a little more, some a little less. This is hyperinflation, like what they had in Germany in the 1920s and so on. And it destroyed people's lives, and destroyed, by the end of the war, people were paying each other and advertising in the papers to buy products with cloth and bacon and salted pork. The money was worthless. It was no longer a standard of value. And I just want to mention, if we have the time, one of the key things that Salmon Chase did. Why did the greenback hold up? He didn't fight the war just with paper. He put a limit on. He said, I'm going to have something real behind that paper. And that was a taxing system. So he and the Congress introduced the income tax for the first time, and many taxes. Nobody likes taxes. As Thaddeus Stevens said, all taxes are odious. They are. But it meant that the real productive power of the United States, or the loyal part of the United States, stood behind the greenback and stood behind the Union effort. It wasn't all paper. And that enabled the North to borrow. Of the total borrowing the North did, the greenbacks are only 1/6. So Chase kept that paper printing to some respectable limit, and therefore they didn't inflate beyond some reasonable amount. And that was a very, very good lesson for that war and other wars, other periods. And they knew what they were doing. They knew in the Revolutionary War that hadn't happened, and the Continentals, inflated, just basically became completely worthless. So this wasn't luck. They had studied their history. They took it seriously. They knew nobody wanted taxes, but they had this tremendous expense. Someone had to pay for them.
Right.
And so they followed both courses.
And I think both of the graphs taken together, and I don't have a side-by-side version, but both of your graphs taken together show the greenback is volatile, but there's never a panic, really.
That's correct.
On the greenback. And with the Confederate money, it seems to be going pretty well for a long time. And then it absolutely hyperinflates. And there's by the end of the war, there's a total financial panic in the Confederates.
It's astonishing how well it went for a long time. The Europeans were very willing to lend to the Confederates. The Confederates themselves, that famous, now famous Unionist in Charleston, South Carolina, one of the last, after Charleston voted to secede, he said, my state is too small for a republic, but it's too large for an insane asylum. Right. What he meant was the South was just completely unprepared and didn't realize it. When they didn't think they'd have a war. They thought that cotton would protect them, that they would be, the North would dare attack them because the mills in Massachusetts and New England needed their cotton. The British and French would protect them because their textile mills needed the cotton. When the war started, Secretary Walker, the Secretary of War in the Confederacy, said, if there's any bloodshed, I'll wipe it away with my handkerchief. And that's how absurdly overconfident they were that this cotton cartel would protect them from bloodshed and from the need to take any financial precautions.
Right. Hey, I have brilliant questions, and I love to listen to myself talk, but I am happy to tell you we have some really great interaction going on our Facebook comments. So I want to say hello to some of our friends who are watching, and I want to let them carry the interview for a little while, if that's all right with you, Roger.
Absolutely.
Now, first of all, I want to shout out to some of our friends. Dave Bradley is watching from the UK again. Thank you, Dave. We may talk about the UK before this hour is up. Rita and Steve are watching from Georgia. Hello, how are you? Always good to see you. And then Matt Nossinger up here in Highland Park says, it's a good subject. I'm curious to hear how deep the analysis goes. Well, like I said, there is analysis, but mostly there's storytelling, great storytelling, Matt. Now, but I have a couple questions, Roger, so let's just jump right into the questions. I have Ted Hochter Sr., and Ted wants to know, first of all, he says, I literally just finished the book while on vacation, and he loved it.
Oh, thank you.
And he said, you brought an admittedly dry topic to life. More of a clarifying question. Ted asks, can you speak to how much the federal debt issued during the war was actually redeemable in gold?
That was left, a good question. That was left unspecified. Jay Cook, of course, who marketed the lion's share of these bonds with the 520 and then the 730. Those are shorthand descriptions of two of the most successful bonds and notes. He promised people redeemable in gold. But believe it or not, it was left unstated. That's just, I guess, something you could get away with in the 1860s and not today. They were very careful to say that the interest would be paid in gold because that was people were going to get right away, and that made them more saleable. It made Thaddeus Stevens, the legislator, hopping mad because the whole idea of the greenback was going to be it was legal tender, everybody was going to get it and treat it equally. And then here, because of this amendment that said that interest would be paid in gold, they decided, well, investors are going to get gold and the rest of us are going to get paper. So how's that equal? It created sort of a bifurcated class system. But they were afraid that investors, and particularly foreign investors, I know we have at least somebody from England along on the show, would want that assurance. So there was no guarantee, but there was a wide expectation that they'd be paid in gold. There was also an expectation that after the war, the greenback would be brought to parity with gold, so it wouldn't matter. And of course, that's ultimately what happened. In 1879, the crime against the century, as inflationists called it, the greenback was brought to parity with gold. That was a tremendously controversial issue in the post-war era. Farmers, miners, anybody who had a commodity sell wanted a little inflation, wanted more greenbacks, and the bankers back east did not. The Republican Party began to gravitate towards the pro-business party we think of now or in the recent past, as distinct from the progressive bunch of upstarts that they were in Lincoln's time, and they went that route. But in the Civil War itself, anyway, it was left uncertain.
Right. Well, Dave Bradley over in the UK does have a question for you. And Dave wants to know, how did the enormous cost of fighting the war affect the country financially after the Civil War was over?
That's a good question. Surprisingly, I guess, the North had built up such an architecture, a financial architecture, in two ways. One, I spoke about the tax, and they kept raising it. Sherman said that we mean to tax everything on the earth. One of his constituents wrote back and said, everything on the earth and under the earth. And there's long descriptions of the book of all the different categories of businesses. They just went one after another: auctioneers, fees, distillers. You really get a sense of the 19th century economy from the descriptions of the jobs. But so we had this huge taxing system, and we had a tariff, much to the displeasure of the British, who had given up their tariff. They were free traders. They did not take very kindly to their American cousins putting a tariff on their products. But the Republicans, basically under cover of war, raised the tariff several times. By the late 1860s, the government had that peculiar embarrassment of large surpluses. And so they had to get rid of either one or the other, either the income tax or the tariff. And this was quite a seminal moment, because the tariff, of course, was very prejudicial. It favored business interests in the East. It discriminated against farmers in the West and the South. The income tax was sort of a leveling mechanism. It was progressive, higher and higher incomes. And the Republicans showed their evolving colors at that point, and they got rid of the income tax. And and they also paid off a lot of that war debt early. So that debt was money good.
Yeah. And then finally, Brian Steenbergen, he's up in Minnesota, and Brian wants to know, what was the impact on wages as the future of slavery became more and more clear during the war? He says, was it the same in the North as in the South?
The impact on wages, I don't think there was an impact from the expectation of slavery. I'll just tell you first, the impact on wages, they went up, but not as much as prices. What do you know? That always seems to happen. It's happening right now in the United States of America. Yeah. As we speak, we have 8% inflation, and we have wage growth, but not that much, right? Yeah. And that happened in the North, and it was a problem. And in fact, Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis were conscious that they said, to bring the evils of the war to the North. They wanted to make people in the North unhappy, so they might vote against the Republican government. and replace it with some government that would sue for peace. There was tremendous fear among white Northerners, no other way to say it, that emancipated slaves, either because they'd been emancipated or they self-emancipated, would come up and take their jobs. This was the source of the so-called draft riots in New York City in July 1863. They were really just race riots. It was an astonishing thing to read about it. It's detailed in the book, just innocent Black folk being lynched on the streets of New York. You have to read about it to gather the enormity of it, the horror of it. And this was egged on. There were quite a few Democratic politicians said this draft is all about sending you down south to free Sambo so he can come up and take your job, as the crude talk went in that day. In fact, very few Blacks made it beyond the battle lines. Many of them went to the lines and stayed with the Union Army. It was a safe haven. But during the war, Lincoln responded to this. He was really torn apart by the draft riots. He identified with the laboring classes. He said, speaking to a delegation of laborers from New York, he said, in the recent incidents, one class of laborers attacked another. He said it should never be so. He viewed laboring men and women as natural allies, and that this shouldn't happen. There was certainly no joining of unions and so on by Blacks in the North. The one area where there was real competition was on the wharfs of New York, and that's where the riots grew out of. Dock workers, Black and Irish, but these were Blacks who lived in New York for decades and decades. In fact, they got there before the Irish, who mostly came to New York, of course, through the famine in the 1850s. The freed Black slaves didn't arrive in New York for quite a while after.
Right. Well, thank you to everybody that asked a question. Thank you to Dave Bradley, Brian Steenbergen, Ted Hochter Sr., Matt Knopfsinger. And it's a wonderful book. And if you want to order it, click through at the link. We will send it to you with Roger's signature on a custom Abraham Lincoln Bookshop book plate. Now, Roger, I told you we're an antiquarian bookshop.
That's right.
So if people want to get the good stuff, the out of print books, the books that you used as the source material for the book, you can get some of them here. And one of them that I want to feature will take us into the Confederate side of the conversation. Maybe we're on the Confederate side of our interview now. And that is, we do have Walter Caper's Life and Times of C.G. Memminger. C.G. Memminger, Christopher Memminger, the Confederate Secretary of the Treasury, or at least for a while. There he is. There's our guy. Well, Roger, tell us about Christopher Memminger. We know about Salmon Chase. What was this guy's challenge?
So can I ask you first, when is that book? What edition of that book is that? Do you have
the edition that we have right here, I believe, is the first one.
Wow.
1893.
Wow.
From Everett Waddy in Richmond, Virginia.
And what's that going for?
We have it on the website. People can check it out, but I have $195 on it.
Well, that's a good price.
It is in very good condition.
That's a good price. C.G. Memminger was born in Germany, one of the provinces, hadn't unified yet. He came over as a very young lad, and he was orphaned early. He was raised as a financier. He had training that Salmon Chase did not. A very conservative financial outlet, much like you'd expect of a good German financier. In fact, he said the most frightening way to raise money is by selling notes, because it inflate. All I can tell you is his reputation for conservative finance did not survive the war.
As we saw from the graph.
Early in the war, one of his cabinet members, Judah Benjamin, proposed that the South take some precautions. There was a lot of cotton in the South, ship it to England, way more than there was demand for the moment. And then they could just sell it off, peel it off as it was needed, and pay for a potentially long war. Neither Memminger nor Jefferson Davis nor anyone else thought it was necessary. They didn't think there'd be a long war. In fact, they came up with a counter plan. It's just so delusory. You almost want to smirk. They proposed to withhold their cotton instead of sending extra cotton, so that the British and French would be so desperate for cotton, they would intervene and stop the war. And this is at a time when the sea lanes remained open, when the Union Navy wasn't close to being able to have an effective blockade. Of course, the strategy was terribly failed. We were talking before the show. I see echoes in this of the Vladimir Putin strategy today, where he thought that his cartel and energy would so strike fear into the hearts of the NATO nations that they would just lie down and let him have his way in
Cotton
Ukraine.
is king.
Cotton is king.
Putin, oil is king.
Oil is king.
Yeah.
And in fact, NATO has some very tough sanctions against Putin, of course, there was a war against the Confederacy. Cotton didn't protect them, and England did not go into to try to stop the war. They were quite wary of a war against the United States, being a war against the United States. Memminger had one other opportunity. It was a potentially golden opportunity. The pun is intended. A financier from France named Erlanger, he was the French member of a German banking family, came to him or wrote to the Confederate diplomats in Europe and said, how about this? I will lend you gold or British sterling, which is as good as gold, hard currency. You can use that to buy ammunition and arms in return for cotton after the war. And this would square the circle. The South had the cotton, but Europe had the cash, but the South couldn't get the cotton to Europe in any quantity when it needed it. So he said, we'll wait. We'll give it to you after the war, and you'll give us the cotton after the war, and we'll give you the cash now. And this was just manna from heaven. And bizarrely, Memminger refused to take more than $15 million of the loan. Erlanger wanted to lend 40, 50 million when the offer was floated in Europe, various European capitals. This is in the spring of 1863 in London, of course, in Paris, in Amsterdam, in a city in Frankfurt in Germany. It was oversubscribed 4 or 5 times. They could have sold 50, 60, 70 million dollars. This would have gone a long, long way towards keeping the Confederacy financially afloat and financially strong. Erlanger was so frustrated, he ran the blockade himself to try to talk sense into the Confederate leadership, but couldn't do it. 15 million was all they raised. Right. It was just an astonishing blown opportunity.
Did I get this number right? I wrote down that, or at least Erlanger calculated that the cotton that he was lending against was worth $190 million.
That's right. So
all they would take was 15 million.
Well, he was offering to do 190, which it was 4 for 1. So the 15 million, there was 60 million in cotton behind it. So that's the reason. And had they borrowed 50 million, there would have been 200 million or so behind it. That's the reason why Europeans were so willing to lend, because the story was, once the war was over, you'd get 4 times as much value in cotton. Well, only 2 big problems with that. One is, when the war was over, price of cotton was going to come down. I mean, that's kind of obvious. The second problem is, if the Confederate loses the war, you're not going to get any cotton, because there's not going to be anybody to pay back your debt. And this was just, there were people who wrote in England, these papers circulated, and I quote them as saying that either government would feel compelled to pay back the Confederate debts. As late as in 1864, these bonds were trading at 80 cents on the dollar, higher at some points than the Union debt, backed by the tax revenue, all the tax revenue of the northern states. It's just astonishing blindness.
Right. Well, you're right. The astonishing blindness by the Confederates, but also the investors. You say investors are cautious when modest sums are at stake, but presented with the potential for vast profits, they lose their heads.
Yes, these investors did, and they lost their
shirts. Is this why European investors were willing to risk huge sums on both the Union and Confederacy when they knew that one of these entities was going to go out of business?
I think it applies to the Confederacy.
Okay.
There was no real, uh, you know, no real reason to predict the Union would go out of business. The Confederacy wasn't going to march up to New England and Chicago and California and take over the North, and nor did they want to. So the people of the North were going to remain in some government, presumably with most or all the northern states. They were going to have the productive power behind them, the taxing power. Those bonds were going to be good. That was there. What was astonishing to me was they were worried. They were very resistant until the end, when they finally turned. They saw which way the war was going, to lend to the North, even though they were a good risk. But with these vast potential profits, 4-for-1, dangling out in front of them with the Confederate bonds, they forgot that if the bonds are worthless, it doesn't matter what the piece of paper says. Yeah. And that was really the financial blindness. It was like, well, these tulips, they're worth everything. Yeah, well, try to find someone to sell these tulips to once the bubble breaks. So
right. So the entire part of the book, the Erlanger chapter is just fascinating, folks, because it's a guy I'd never heard of, and it really portrays the questions, like you say, almost delusory attitudes of both the investors and the Confederates in the possibilities of cotton. And as we said before, I made a note here, it's a little like what a certain despot in Russia is trying to do right now. He thinks he has a lever to hold over the entire world with his oil while he attacks somebody, and it's not nearly worth as much as he seems to think it is, if Putin reads his American history.
Yes, and I think this delusion in both cases grow out of seclusion. We've read that Putin has increasingly isolated himself. He has a smaller and smaller circle of advisors. They're not telling him anything he doesn't want to hear anyway. Mm-hmm. The South was very similar. There was an ideological and philosophical and political cocoon. They had this ideology of slavery, of course, whereas in the early decades of the 19th century, Southerners would say things like slavery is going to fade away. We just have to figure out how to do it, when to do it. That was Jefferson's position. By the late 1840s and 1850s, the rhetoric had changed. Slavery was a good thing. It was good for the Black man, they said, for whatever reasons. They said it was good for the labor system. They had a harmonious labor system, whereas the North had labor conflicts between labor and management. They were more and more drinking their own Kool-Aid. Speakers went around the South urging them to industrialize, to don't leave themselves at the mercy of the North. Many Southerners said, we don't want it, we don't need it, we want to live sedentary in the past with our slave labor system. This kind of intellectual cocoon. There was a man named Rowan Helper, a poor North Carolinian, who wrote a fascinating book in the late 1850s called The Impending Crisis of the South. His father was what was known as a poor slaveholder, a small farmer, owned a few slaves. And what Helper said,
I wish I had a copy of that to show, because that's a really neat, terrific. That's a really neat artifact if you can get it.
So what he said was, this whole mythology of the South, of his South, was a myth. It was not good for the poor white man, which was most of the whites of the South. Most whites didn't own slaves. It was only good for the upper crust minority that owned slaves, and a lot of slaves. He said it was a sham democracy, just really an oligarchy, as we'd say today, of Russian businessmen. And Southerners ought to wake up. This book was a bestseller in the North. Its distribution was banned in many Southern states. Right. They wouldn't touch it. And when the war happened, you see this ideology continuing in the effort by the wealthy to persuade the white commoner that they were fighting in their interest. The governor of Georgia, a man named Joseph Brown, in 1860, said, "Slavery is the poor man's best government." That's a very interesting comment. He was saying, our government's not going to give you canals and roads and railroads and a college program and a modern tax system. our government is going to give you slavery. We're going to put you above the pecking order, above the enslaved class. That's all we're going to offer you. But that was the deal, and it shows you the intellectual backwardness, I think, and this intellectual cocoon that they were in. It does remind me of an autocrat, a modern autocrat.
Right, right. Hey, we only have a few minutes left, so one thing I do want to do is let's see where the nuts and bolts of the war intersect with finance, and because they do affect each other. And of course, that means let's talk a little bit about the blockade. The Union is going to try to squeeze the Confederacy with this blockade, and it will be I was going to say more or less effective, but I guess my question is, Roger, was it more or less effective, the Union blockade?
Well, it was less, and then it became more. First, I should say Lincoln made a mistake. He announced the blockade, and Thaddeus Stevens hustled to tell him, Mr. President, you don't blockade your own cities. You close them. If you close them, foreign powers can't go near them. Then there'd be smugglers. That'd be an act of war. You blockade foreign ports, and by having declared a blockade, you are implicitly and actually implicitly under the rules of war declaring these cities as foreign. You don't want to do that. Right. It was too late. In the beginning, the blockade affected the South because it made shipping more troublesome. They got these shallow draft vessels that couldn't carry that much. They only traveled at night, of course, to evade the Union Navy. They would go from southern ports to nearby Caribbean ports, and there they'd offload onto bigger ships, usually flying under the British flag that couldn't be touched by the Union Navy, and cross the Atlantic. As the war went on, the Union built more ships, and the Navy got better and better. Something like 6 out of 7, maybe 9 out of 10 ships got through the first year, and they made on every ship that went through, and these were mostly under private charter. These are private enterprise doing these ships. They made something like 500% profits. I mean, they were real Rhett Butlers running these, running cotton for arms and so on. As the war went on, it seemed to get much closer to half getting caught, and they had to take much greater precautions, obviously, to not get caught, which meant the times of day they could go, which ports were open, and then one by one, the southern ports were captured. New Orleans being the first major port being captured, so there were fewer areas they could sail out of. Finally, in February of 1865, Wilmington, the last Confederate port of any significance, was captured. The port was, and Southerners realized at the time that this was a very, very significant moment, that the Southern economy, to the extent that it had an economy, was now closed. Somebody actually wrote in the local press down south that they would now have to develop a machinery. Well, it was way too late to build. There were no machine tools. All the men were off at war. I mean, that ship had, sorry to mix metaphors, that ship had really sailed.
Right.
But so the blockade, I think, was largely effective, something we may not have time to get into, but the Union weakened its effect to some extent by itself trading and trading, with the South, with so-called loyalists in the South, because it wanted the cotton. Kind of a crazy thing, as if we went into the Russia now and said, well, are you loyal to our cause? Well, we'll take your oil, but not yours. And this actually helped keep the South alive in the waning year or two. All these Rhett Butler types, again, going down, getting papers. A lot of them were friends of various government officials. Lincoln was swamped by requests for trading licenses down south. It drove Grant and Sherman and the other generals crazy. Sherman said, quite bluntly, you can't make war on a people and trade with them at the same time. It seems obvious, but the North did it. So they weakened their own blockade. Right.
Oh yeah, there are so many things that I would have wanted to get to in our long conversation. We're coming up to the end of it now, but what else do you cover? You cover the issues with the bonds. You cover Judah Benjamin. We only talked about him very quickly. Thaddeus Stevens. How does the it's not just the secretaries of the Treasury, it's the chairs of the committees, Ways and Means Committee in the Congress. And so you're going to learn about those kinds of folks. I guess I want to ask one quick question about Congress. We recently had a Jeffrey Frank here talking about the presidency of Harry S. Truman. President Truman made his bones, if you will, in Washington as a watchdog over the wartime economy. Can you point at anybody in Congress, in the U.S. Congress, that played a role similar to Truman? Because we're having an explosion of government spending. It's probably pretty easy for corruption to take a hand.
Let's see. Blair, of course, the brother of a cabinet member and a big enemy of Salmon Chase, dug very deeply into the relationship between Salmon Chase and Jay Cook. Jay Cook was the union financier. These two were very close.
There's a scandal.
I don't want to give you the wrong impression. Jay Cook never profited from it, although he did get all kinds of advice. And Jay Cook opened his home to Chase and to his daughters. He gave him personal investment advice. And Blair was out to ruin Chase. He made hay investigating this relationship. And also, there was one Treasury clerk who was carrying on with lady folks at night in the Treasury building, and just to embarrass Chase. This is really a personal rivalry between the two of them, and he succeeded in embarrassing Chase. There was the supervision was extremely lax, and if you go to the Union Pacific Railroad, although they did put two government watchdogs on the board, we know how lax that was because of the Credit Mobilier scandal a few years later, when both the then vice president, the later vice president, were both implicated in it. It was, and many congressmen had been bought off. Basically, they allowed the UP to not even be required to go to the lowest bidder and to pad their expenses terribly in building this very important railroad. The Congress hadn't chartered a private company since 1816. This was the first time they did it. Since then, they weren't practiced in it. They wanted to get the railroad built. They wanted to get the war financed. Jay Cook had gave Salmon Chase a way to do it. So they just weren't up on modern regulation and modern scruples in that sense. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that Salmon Chase was other than personally scrupulous. He was.
Right. We're about out of time, but let me say, do you think you have a brief capstone to discuss or to describe what we talked about at the top of the interview, that financially and economically speaking, the Civil War was revolutionary?
Yes.
What didn't we know that we will know after reading Ways and Means?
The epigram from the book is a quote from Robert Penn Warren: "The revolution did not create a nation. It was just, as Jefferson called the federal government, it was a confederation, a loose patchwork." And I think Lincoln's government, the Congress and the Lincoln government, created that nation through all these programs: financing, social, economic. And I think he created the nation that people like Alexander Hamilton might have dreamed of, but we didn't get until the Civil War. And that was something I learned about. And I think readers will find it interesting.
Yeah. Okay, everybody. The book is Ways and Means: Lincoln and His Cabinet and the Financing of the Civil War. It's 432 pages from the Penguin Press. Thank you, Penguin Press, for publishing it and helping us put together this interview with the author, Roger Lowenstein. Thank you, Roger, for joining us today. And if you're watching this on our YouTube channel after the event is over, we will probably still have first edition copies of Ways and Means that you will get with a signed custom Abraham Lincoln Bookshop book plate. So thank you again, Roger. Thank you to everybody who has been watching, and we will see you next time on A House Divided.